In 1051, Edward the Confessor was at loggerheads with the powerful Earl of Wessex, Godwin, whose daughter Edith Edward was married to. The arguments centred around the visit to England of Edward's brother in law, Eustace, Count of Boulogne, who had fallen out with the people of Dover. Godwin went against the king's wishes and sided with the English, leading to a very tense standoff that would result in Godwin and his family being briefly exiled from England. For a time, Edward was left in a state of utmost perplexity as to what to do, but his courage was restored when the king realised that he had significant support in his standoff against Godwin. Among those backing the king included Edward's nephew Ralph, the son of the king's sister Goda from her first marriage to Drogo of Mont. Goda had joined her brothers Edward and Alfred, as well as their mother Emma and eventually their father Athelred, in exile in Normandy in 1013. Whilst Edward's destiny would be the crown of England and Alfred's a violent death, Goda would instead be simply married off, firstly to Drogo of Mont, before she later married Eustace, the count who had caused such trouble in England in 1051. Eustace II himself would also be the father of the great Godfrey of Bouillon from his own second marriage. Godfrey of Bouillon was, of course, the man who made such a name for himself during the First Crusade. Ralph is known to history as the Timid, with Florence of Worcester describing him as that cowardly son of King Edward's sister, although it is very questionable if that assessment is fair. As Earl of Hereford, Ralph assembled as many men as he could from his county and marched in the name of the king during the dispute with Godwin. Whilst Edward had certainly been on the brink of losing his nerve in the quarrel with Godwin, when he learned that Ralph and other nobles were now fully prepared to support him, the king resolved that he would not permit Eustace to surrender to Godwin, and after a brief attempt at restoring peace, with hostages exchanged, Edward, thanks to the support of the likes of Ralph, considered himself strong enough to take a firm stance against Godwin. The king refused to grant the earl a safe passage to London for a meeting with the king, as Godwin had demanded, and ultimately he sent the earl into exile after Godwin had fled from London. However, the earl would return, with Ralph being placed in charge of the fleet that was assembled to prevent Godwin and his family from returning to England. However, Ralph's efforts failed, and the mighty Godwin family were restored to power. In 1055, Ralph's control of Herefordshire came under threat in the face of an alliance between the Welsh king Gruffydd ap Llywelyn and an earl named Alfgar, who was, according to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, outlawed by King Edward without fault on Alfgar's part. Assembling a combined army of Englishmen, Normans, and Frenchmen, Ralph rode out on horseback to meet the danger posed by Alfgar and Gruffydd, but his campaign proved to be a debacle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that the English portion of Ralph's army fled before battle was even joined, but nonetheless a massacre still took place as Ralph's army retreated. Florence of Worcester lays the blame for this at Ralph's door. Ralph, he said, had ordered the Englishmen in his army to fight on horseback, contrary to their custom. But as the battle was about to start, Ralph and his Normans fled with the English not far behind. Hundreds were massacred as they attempted to retreat, which is not a surprise. Ralph, it seemed, had realised that the use of horses with the English was a terrible miscalculation, and the ensuing massacre was brought about by a very confused retreat. Whether Ralph's actions were cowardice, as Florence considers it, is debatable. It certainly seems more of a case of a military decision that went badly wrong rather than cowardice. Ralph's reputation, however, would suffer as a result of the fiasco at Hereford, earning him the unflattering epithet the Timid. Gruffydd and Alfgar were able to pillage, burn, and massacre as they pleased throughout Herefordshire before they returned to Wales with plenty of treasures and hostages. Ralph can't be blamed entirely for these shambolic scenes. The king himself had played a huge role in Alfgar's anger, depriving him of his earldom in East Anglia for no good reason. Edward then employed Harold, the son of Earl Godwin, who had died in 1053, to restore law and order, and Alfgar would eventually make peace with the king, although it does feel like an episode that was entirely avoidable. Ralph the Timid died in 1057, still a young man, not much older than 30. The chronicler Gaimar says this of Ralph: "He was a right good man, a short time he lived." The Earl was buried at Peterborough. Summarising Ralph seems to be a fairly difficult thing to do. I think to call him a coward or timid seems to be quite harsh. Clearly, as evidenced in 1051, he had some courage in him. I think Ralph has simply suffered a good deal from the farce at Hereford, where a couple of bad decisions on his part led to the people in his domain being vulnerable to Alfgar's and Griffith's violent revolt. It seems to me we should probably blame the perpetrators of the violence more than the Earl who tried but failed to stop it. History can be unforgiving.